You want the price, old man? It's more than your whole pension. The salesman sneered loud enough for the showroom to hear. Laughter rippled from nearby customers. Phones rose, ready to record humiliation. But the old man didn't flinch. He just touched the truck's worn metal like it was something sacred. Then turned and walked away, not saying a single word. The salesman was still laughing until the ground began to rumble. 3 army jeeps rolled in from different directions. No sirens, no shouting. Doors opened, soldiers stepped out. No one said a word. They didn't have to because that truck didn't belong on a lot. It already had a driver, and he'd paid for it with blood, fire, and a welding torch under enemy fire. At 78 years old, Joseph Joe Kesler wasn't the kind of man you forgot after meeting once. Tall and lean, with hands calloused by firewood and time, and a stare that had seen more war than most men had seen winters. He lived alone in a modest log cabin carved into the edge of the Sawtooth Range in central Idaho, a place where the mountains met the sky, and silence was a second language. Joe had been up here for nearly 30 years, ever since his wife Diane passed away. The town folks in McCall still remembered her warm smile and the way Joe's shoulders had slumped at her funeral, like something inside him had folded in half. Since then, he'd kept mostly to himself, raising chickens, chopping wood, and tinkering with the same beat-up 1980 Chevy K20 that had carried him through every snowstorm since the Reagan years. But this year was different. October came early. The mountain air turned sharp before the leaves could finish falling. That first morning, frost had been thicker than usual, clinging like a warning. And then, like the last breath of an old soldier, Joe's truck coughed one final time and gave out on the road near his wood pile. No tow truck would come that far into the hills. He didn't call one anyway. He knew what that meant. Without a working truck, he couldn't get supplies, couldn't haul logs, couldn't make the trip down the mountain for his monthly VA appointments. More than anything, it meant one bad snowstorm could seal him in for good. Joe didn't fear the cold. He'd slept in foxholes in the jungles of Quang Tri. But he respected winter. And winter in Idaho wasn't a season. It was a siege. So that Monday, Joe wiped the dirt off his boots, put on his old flannel shirt, and headed into town. Not to borrow, not to ask for help. Joe Kesler didn't do pity. He went with one purpose. Find a truck that could carry him through one more winter. He just didn't expect it to be that truck. The town of Clearwater wasn't big. Just a stretch of highway framed by gas stations, diners, and a coffee shop that changed owners every 2 years. But it had one thing Joe Kesler needed. Iron Ridge Motors. It was the kind of place you couldn't miss. New flagstone walls, neon signs, pop music blasting from hidden speakers, giant banners fluttering in the breeze, promising, no credit, no problem, and drive away today. The lot gleamed under a cloudless sky, rows of polished vehicles lined up like soldiers on parade. SUVs with more screens than storage, lifted trucks too pretty to scratch, sedans so sleek they looked afraid of gravel. Joe pulled his wool collar up and crossed the parking lot on foot. He hadn't driven in. That much was obvious to the man in the showroom who barely looked up from his phone. No one walks to a dealership unless they're lost or broke, or in Joe's case, both things on the surface, and neither underneath. Joe looked like trouble if you didn't know better. His boots had seen better decades. The cracked leather repaired more than once with the same stubborn stitching he'd used on field gear back in Vietnam. His flannel was frayed at the cuffs and elbows, and the faded ball cap pulled low over his brow bore no logo, just sun-bleached canvas and familiarity. Around his wrist was the only thing that still ticked like it used to, a scratched military-issued Timex with a green canvas strap and a silent history strapped to it. He didn't speak to the first few salesmen that passed him. Let them whisper. Let them judge. He wasn't there for them. He moved through the rows with practiced patience, ignoring chrome grills and spotless rims, walking like a man who knew what not to trust. He passed a blue Tacoma with a lift kit, walked right by a Ford Raptor that looked more showroom than mud run. Joe wasn't hunting for horsepower or prestige. He was looking for soul. And in the back corner where the pavement ended and the gravel lot began, he found it. A faded military green Dodge Power Wagon, mid-90s model, parked like it didn't care about first impressions. No chrome, no flash. The kind of truck that looked like it had earned every dent, every patch of rust. Joe's breath caught for a moment. He approached slowly. It wasn't the color that got him. It was the weld pattern along the tailgate. Subtle, easy to miss unless you'd made welds like that in the field under fire with your non-dominant hand while someone yelled for cover. Joe touched the driver's side door gently, like greeting an old dog. There was something about the way the paint had faded, the way the hinges creaked, that felt familiar, like maybe this truck hadn't just been a military surplus vehicle. Maybe it had been his. Joe was still standing beside the power wagon, one hand resting on the hood, eyes narrowed, not inspecting, remembering. His fingers traced the edge of a dent near the front fender. Not an accident, he thought. That looked like shrapnel or maybe a field mod gone wrong. He half smiled. The kind of smile only men who've survived bad odds carry in their bones. That's when the voice cut through the lot. You want the price, old man? It's more than your whole pension. The words hit like a slap, loud enough to make two couples turn around. A young salesman strutted up, tablet in hand, teeth white, hair slicked back like a man who cared more about his reflection than his reputation. He laughed almost proudly, nodding toward the truck like it was a joke that had just written itself. Another chuckle rose from a nearby SUV. A kid barely out of high school pulled out his phone. You could feel it in the air, that cheap kind of energy people get when they think someone weaker is about to be embarrassed. They were waiting for Joe to sputter, to defend himself, to beg for a deal. But Joe didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even look at the salesman. He just kept his hand on the truck, slid it slightly down the hood, like he was smoothing the ears out of the metal. Like the laughter didn't reach him because it didn't. Joe wasn't in that parking lot anymore. He was somewhere else. Somewhere hotter, louder, dustier. A place where men didn't laugh at dents. They survived them. The salesman took a step back, a little thrown by the silence. Well, he said, but the edge in his voice had started to dull. Still, Joe said nothing. Just nodded once to the truck like they shared a secret the kid could never understand. Then he turned and walked away. Joe lingered by the tailgate, running his fingers along the faint seam of old welds, sloppy to the untrained eye, but to him they were like fingerprints. Every jagged line told a story. And there it was, a particular crescent weld at the corner where the panel met the frame. He hadn't seen it in decades, but his hands remembered. A breath escaped him like a ghost from the jungle. This was ours. Charlie 7, he murmured. It wasn't meant for anyone else to hear, just a whisper to the truck, or maybe to the ghost it carried. Charlie 7 was the call sign for his transport unit in Vietnam. The one that ran logistics convoys through places maps had forgotten. The one that patched bullet holes by flashlight and welded armor plating with whatever scrap they could strip from broken down wrecks. Back then, trucks didn't just move gear. They carried lives and they had personalities. This one, she was a mule. Ugly, loud, but loyal. Joe closed his eyes for half a second. He saw flashes, rain slicking red mud, a buddy yelling through gunfire, the truck lurching forward, tires nearly bald, tailpipe howling like it was screaming along with them. This truck had carried them out, and apparently it had kept going, ended up in Idaho somehow. He stepped back as if letting go of a friend's hand for the last time, turned without a word, and walked across the lot. His boots scuffed against the pavement with a quiet rhythm, steady, unrushed. The same kind of walk you saw in men who'd learned long ago that noise didn't solve anything. Out on the sidewalk, Joe reached into the chest pocket of his flannel and pulled out a relic most people hadn't seen in years. A battered old flip phone held together with duct tape and faith. He flipped it open with a pop, dialed from memory. It rang once, twice, then a gruff voice picked up. Yeah, Breener, Joe said. It's Kesler from Charlie 7. A long pause. No kidding. You still breathing, old man? Barely, but I found her. Who? The power wagon from Kandahar. Weld line still there. Same patch job. Another pause. Then the voice sharpened. Where are you? Joe glanced over his shoulder at the shining lot. The salesman. The truck. Iron Ridge Motors. Clear water. Bring the others. Then he closed the phone, slid it back into his pocket, and leaned against a rusted guardrail. The air was still, but something had shifted. Something was coming. The salesman was back at his routine, leaning against a polished SUV, scrolling through social media, already laughing about the old guy who thought he could afford a military truck. His smirk hadn't faded when the ground started to tremble. Not violently, just enough to be felt, like a low, steady heartbeat under the asphalt. The music playing over the loudspeakers cut through the afternoon air. Something poppy and forgettable. But beneath it, something deeper rolled in. Rubber over gravel, engines low and synchronized. From 3 different streets converging like clockwork came 3 olive-drab army jeeps. No sirens, no lights, no license plate slogans, just clean, well-maintained vehicles driven with a level of precision that made it clear. This wasn't casual. Customers on the lot stopped mid-sentence. One man froze halfway into a test drive. Another stepped out of a convertible, shielding his eyes. The sales team turned to look and their rehearsed grins faltered. The jeeps didn't park in random places. They executed a textbook containment pattern. One at the front of the lot, one to the rear. One slid along the side with a quiet hum and cut its engine. A soft thump as doors opened simultaneously. 6 soldiers stepped out. Their boots hit the pavement like punctuation. No shouting, no weapons raised, just presence. They wore crisp uniforms, name tapes visible, posture squared. The sun hit the edge of their sunglasses, but their expressions stayed unreadable. And one of them, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, moving like a man who'd spent more nights in combat zones than on couches, walked straight toward the power wagon. Staff Sergeant Breener. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission. He approached the truck with the reverence of a soldier returning to a battlefield grave. His gloved hand brushed the weld line near the tailgate. He tilted his head slightly and nodded as if confirming what he already knew. The young salesman jogged toward him, the swagger now shaken. "Excuse me. Sir, is there a problem? Is this a repo thing?" Breener didn't even look at him at first. Then he turned slowly. "That truck's not for sale," he said, voice low but sharp. "It's returning home." The salesman blinked, confused. "What?" "You're standing in front of a vehicle that carried wounded through hostile fire in Kandahar, reinforced in the field, welded by a man who bled while he worked." The kid took a step back. "We don't need a receipt. We've got the welds." All around them, people had stopped moving. Even the loudspeakers had gone quiet as if the entire dealership was holding its breath. No one else said a word because they didn't have to. Something sacred had entered the space, and everyone felt it. The young salesman stood there, frozen between pride and panic. His hands twitched, still gripping his digital tablet like it could somehow shield him from what was unfolding around him. The lot had gone silent, like a stage between scenes. The only sound was the ticking of a nearby SUV's engine cooling in the heat. One of the soldiers, tall, younger, maybe mid-20s, stepped forward. He held a single sheet of folded paper, creased and worn, like it had been carried in a wallet for years. He offered it to the salesman without flourish, without drama. "What's this?" the salesman asked, voice shaky. "Read it," the soldier replied. The salesman unfolded the paper. His eyes scanned the list. First with confusion, then with disbelief. Bronze Star awarded for acts of heroism under combat conditions. 3 Purple Hearts wounded in action. 3 separate engagements. 5 comrades rescued under direct enemy fire. 212 consecutive days in combat zones without rotation. 1 truck. This truck driven into an ambush to extract a pinned-down squad. His lips moved silently, trying to take it in. This is a service record." "No," Staff Sergeant Breener said, stepping closer. "That's a receipt." The soldier's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You said he couldn't afford the truck, but he already paid for it in 1968 with grit, with blood, and with a welding torch under enemy fire. While most men were trying to stay alive, he was trying to keep that truck alive, too. Because it was the only way out. The salesman swallowed hard. I didn't know. You didn't ask, Breener said. You looked at his boots and saw poverty. You looked at his age and saw weakness, but you didn't see the man. You didn't see the years he carried. A hush had fallen again. Even the other salesmen had stopped pretending to work. A family that had been test driving a compact SUV had stepped back onto the lot, watching from a distance. An elderly couple near the service center held hands as if remembering something they tried not to. This vehicle, Breener continued, was never yours to sell. Not really. You were just holding on to it until it could find its way home. The paper, now trembling in the salesman's hand, folded back down. The words were simple, but their weight was crushing. Some debts, Breener had said, don't come with interest rates or financing plans. Some are paid in full long before the rest of the world understands their value. And Joe Kesler, who at that moment hadn't even returned to the lot yet, had already covered every penny. Just as the tension on the lot settled into something reverent and still, the low hum of tires on pavement returned. Not loud, not urgent, just steady, rhythmic. A dark green Jeep circled the corner of the block and came to a gentle stop near the front entrance of Iron Ridge Motors. The rear door opened and out stepped Joe Kesler. No one called attention to him. No one had to. He walked like the mountain wind, slow, solid, and inevitable. His boots tapped against the pavement, and though he said nothing, every head turned. Not in confusion now, not in mockery, in realization. He made his way through the crowd, through the silence, past rows of gleaming chrome and untouched showroom glass, and stopped in front of the truck. The old power wagon, faded and dented, as unpolished as the man who once drove it through chaos, and came out alive. Breener stepped forward and stood at attention. The crispness in his posture cut through the air like a blade. Then slowly he brought his hand to his brow and delivered a salute. Perfect in form, precise in respect. Sir, he said, voice low, barely above a whisper. You welded her together outside Da Nang. She remembered. Joe's eyes didn't blink. They stayed fixed on the weld line. A slight nod, nothing theatrical, passed between him and the soldier. He didn't return the salute. He didn't have to. Respect doesn't always echo back the same way it arrives. Joe reached for the handle. The metal was still warm from the sun, and yet it felt familiar, like shaking the hand of someone you hadn't seen in decades, but never really forgot. The door creaked as it opened, not with protest, but with age, honest and unashamed. He stepped up into the seat like muscle memory was carrying him. Sat down, closed the door, and then he didn't start it. He didn't grab the wheel like someone ready to drive away in triumph. He just sat there, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting gently on his leg. His shoulders lowered, not from age, but from a weight finally let go. Outside, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause. Inside that old truck cab, the air was still, the past humming faintly in the dashboard. His eyes closed briefly, not in sleep, but in connection. He wasn't in Clearwater anymore. Not entirely. Part of him was back in a dusty field outside Da Nang, hearing the whine of distant mortars and the grunt of wounded men being loaded into the back of that very truck. No music played, no cheering followed. The moment simply existed, like fog, thick, silent, and sacred. The ignition clicked once, then again. A low, familiar rumble filled the lot. The kind of deep-throated growl only old engines make when they know exactly who's behind the wheel. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It was the sound of a machine recognizing the hands that had once kept it alive. Joe Kesler sat behind the wheel like he never left. His hands didn't tremble. His posture didn't slouch. If anything, he looked younger in that moment, straighter-backed, eyes steadier, shoulders squared beneath a flannel shirt that had known too many winters and one more summer than anyone expected. He reached out through the open window and turned his head slowly toward the salesman, who now stood several paces back, shoulders stiff with shame and awe. Keys, Joe said, quiet and even. Not a demand, just a statement of fact. The young man, humbled beyond words, reached into his pocket with a hand that shook slightly. He pulled out the key ring, extended it forward, and walked carefully, deliberately, until he stood next to the window. No jokes, no excuses, just reverence. Joe took the keys with a nod. Nothing more. Across the lot, no one clapped. There were no photo ops, no grand speeches, only the subtle shuffle of feet as people instinctively stepped back, giving space to a moment they barely understood but deeply felt. The soldiers still in formation near the jeeps didn't speak either. They simply stood in silent witness, heads slightly bowed because they knew. Because they recognized what was happening. Something more than a transaction. Something earned in blood and heat and time. That night, long after the lot had emptied and the sun had dipped behind the western ridges, Iron Ridge Motors quietly updated its website. The Power Wagon was gone from the listings. In its place was a single line of text. No fanfare, no marketing jargon. This vehicle returned home today. It shows its driver. No social media announcement, no press release, just a quiet digital acknowledgement that sometimes value isn't measured in dollars, and some sales can't be made. But someone did take a screenshot. That line traveled. By morning, it had found its way into a veterans forum. By afternoon, it had been posted in a Facebook group for the 117th Transportation Battalion with a caption that simply read, "She found her way back." And by evening, the story had gone further than anyone at the dealership could have imagined. Not because of flash, but because of dignity. Because when something is returned to the hands that once saved it, you don't need a headline. You just need silence and respect. By the next morning, the dealership didn't know what hit them. It started small. One screenshot shared in a closed Facebook group for Army transport veterans. Just a simple photo. The dealership's webpage with that quiet caption under a blank truck listing. This vehicle returned home today. It shows its driver. One comment appeared beneath it. Charlie 7. That's Joe Kesler's rig, isn't it? And then it spread. Old names started chiming in. Soldiers from units stationed in Vietnam, Kuwait, Kandahar. People Joe hadn't seen or spoken to in decades suddenly remembered the old power wagon with the dented door and the weld seam that curved like a question mark under fire. Within hours, the forums were full of photos, grainy, sun-bleached, and scanned from old film rolls. Joe in uniform crouched next to the truck, helmet on, grease on his cheek. Another showed the same vehicle half covered in a tarp, sandbags piled high in the back. A third photo stopped people cold. Joe welding by flashlight, the truck's tailgate propped up with ammo crates while mortar fire blurred in the distance. One retired sergeant commented, "That's the same weld job we used to joke about." Called it Kesler stitching. Said it would hold a convoy together with duct tape and stubbornness. The post exploded. Veterans from 3 generations commented with stories, memories, even tears. One younger soldier wrote, "My dad always talked about a guy who drove straight into a firefight to pull out the wounded. Said he never saw a man cuss out a broken axle and patch it with so much love. Guess I just learned his name." Meanwhile, back at the dealership, management reached out to Joe. They wanted to make a gesture. Free servicing for life. A full repaint. Maybe even a local news feature. Joe declined every offer with just 5 words. Don't repaint the past. Donate instead. He didn't want the truck touched. Not the rust, not the dents, not even the chipped paint on the driver's side door. That wasn't damage. That was history. But he had one request. Take the money they would have spent on servicing and paint jobs and donate it directly to the local VA hospital's transportation fund. The one that helped get older veterans to medical appointments when they couldn't drive themselves anymore. The dealership agreed quietly. No press release, no oversized check. And that money, it paid for new tires on the VA van, helped 3 elderly vets get to physical therapy, covered fuel costs for an entire winter. Joe never asked for thanks. He didn't post about it. Didn't tell anyone except Breener and the soldiers who had stood with him that day. But the story kept traveling anyway. Passed along like an old war medal, passed hand to hand, not for glory, but because it meant something. And long after Joe had returned to his quiet cabin in the hills, his legacy was already moving across forums, across counties, across generations, on 4 dusty wheels, in the minds of those who understood that not all heroes are in uniform. Some just never take the key off their chain. A week after the story went quiet online, a convoy of 3 jeeps wound their way up a narrow gravel road carved into the Idaho mountains. No orders, no cameras, just soldiers showing up because they knew. When one of theirs gave everything, you didn't let him face the cold alone. They arrived at Joe Kesler's cabin just after sunrise. The place was exactly as they imagined, a small log home tucked into a clearing, the forest encroaching like an old friend. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. A rusted axe leaned against a stump. The power wagon was parked beneath a weathered lean-to, still wearing every scratch and scar like campaign ribbons. Joe was already splitting wood when they pulled in. He didn't look surprised. He just leaned on his axe, wiped his brow with a red rag, and nodded. "About time," he said. The soldiers didn't waste words either. They unloaded gear. 2 of them went to stacking wood. Another rewired the cabin's generator. One soldier, Rivera, sharp-eyed and quiet, fixed the leaky pipe Joe hadn't quite admitted was a problem. They stayed for 3 days. No schedule, no formal plan, just work by day and stories by night. Evenings were spent on the porch, passing a dented thermos filled with black coffee or something stronger, watching the sun dip behind the ridgeline. Sometimes they talked about the war. More often they didn't. They just sat in silence that felt more honest than words. One morning, as frost edged the pines and the cabin's tin roof began to creak in the sun, Joe stepped outside and found something taped to the back of the power wagon. A simple piece of cardboard written in thick black marker. "This truck doesn't run on gas. It runs on memory." There was no signature, no explanation. Joe didn't ask. He didn't take it down either. Not even when rain came. He sealed the edges in clear tape, nailed it gently to the wood plank above the bumper, and let it live there, weathered like everything else he respected. That truck had become more than a machine. It was a monument now, a living memory on 4 wheels. In town, when Joe drove it down for supplies, people nodded, not out of pity or praise, but with the kind of recognition that passes between those who know. And back at the cabin, the soldiers promised they'd be back before the snow fell too deep. Not because Joe needed help, but because you don't let your brothers face the cold alone. And when they drove away, the sign still flapped gently in the breeze behind the power wagon. Joe stood beside it for a while, hand resting on the truck bed, just listening, because some engines speak louder when they're not running. 6 months later, the mountains were quiet. It was late spring when Joe Kesler passed. No storm, no struggle, just one more sunrise he didn't rise for. They found him in his bed, flannel shirt folded neatly on the chair beside him, boots at the door, the power wagon parked just where it always was, facing east. The medical examiner said it was peaceful, his hands were still strong, his back still straight, his heart, they said, had simply completed its mission. Word reached Staff Sergeant Breener within the day. And just like before, no orders were issued. No press release followed. But 3 Army jeeps rolled through Clearwater once more, just as they had before. Quiet, deliberate, precise, the same formation, the same silence, no sirens, no horns, just gravel under tires and the weight of remembrance. They parked just outside the cemetery gates, forming that familiar triangle of presence. Then one by one the soldiers stepped out. Some of them younger now, others the same who had stood with Joe half a year before. At the head of the small service, there were no eulogies read aloud, no list of medals, no recounting of war stories. Joe wouldn't have wanted that. Instead, they let the wind carry the weight. The pine trees rustled faintly. The flag above the cemetery's entrance flapped softly in rhythm with the breeze. One soldier approached the power wagon parked next to the flagpole, still unwashed, still proudly scarred. He opened the glove box and gently placed a single item inside. Joe's original dog tag, its edges worn from decades of movement, its chain wrapped neatly. Another soldier stepped forward and laid a folded flag across the hood, not draped carelessly, but offered like one soldier offering respect to another story. And then they stood still for 1 minute and 17 seconds. 1 second for every mission Joe's unit had logged in country. No words, no movement, just a silence so complete it pressed against the heart. A final salute not of rank, but of worth. Because Joe Kesler didn't die with fanfare. He died with dignity. And for men like him, that's more than enough. Joe Kesler didn't have much family left. No children, no wife, just a nephew named Daniel who remembered visiting the mountain cabin once as a boy. The smell of wood smoke and black coffee lingering longer than any conversation they ever had. Daniel didn't pretend to understand his uncle's life. But when he stood beside the battered power wagon after the funeral, hand on the weather-worn fender, he understood one thing clearly. This wasn't just a truck. It was a story on wheels. A few weeks later, Daniel met with the director of the County War Museum, an old brick building tucked behind the courthouse, run mostly by volunteers and funded by donations. He didn't bring a press kit or speech, just keys, Joe's dog tags, and a simple request. Keep it how it was. Don't shine it up. They agreed. And so the truck was moved gently without fanfare into the museum's newly expanded Veterans exhibit, not on a platform, not behind ropes, but parked on a stretch of dirt and gravel they brought in special to make it feel like it had just rolled off a trail. The power wagon remained unpolished, its dents and rust left untouched. The cabin still smelled faintly of pinewood, diesel, and something older. Sweat, smoke, and stubbornness. Joe's thermos sat in the cup holder. A pair of leather gloves rested on the seat. In the glove box, his dog tag, his VA appointment card, and a folded napkin with an oil-stained note scribbled in his handwriting. Check left tire. Slow leak. Still climbs though. Visitors came. Veterans lingered. Children pointed and asked questions their parents couldn't always answer. And that was the point. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a lesson in silence, service, and the weight of memory. One museum volunteer, a Marine vet himself, put up a small sign beside it. This truck drove through hell and back home again. It waited for one driver and he found his way back. And every so often, a kid would lean close to the bumper and smile at the faded cardboard, still taped above it. It runs on memory, and somehow it still did. Back at Iron Ridge Motors, the space where the power wagon once sat remained empty for weeks. No one dared park there. The gravel patch at the far end of the lot, where no banners hung, where no flags waved, held a kind of quiet weight. And then one morning, just before Memorial Day, a bench appeared. Simple wooden olive drab. No brass plaque. No inscription. Just one handwritten line burned into the wood near the edge of the seat. Some men don't test drive. They carried the keys long before we priced them. It wasn't installed by the dealership manager. Not by marketing. It was the young salesman. The same one who once laughed too loud and looked too little. Who now arrived early on Memorial Day morning alone in jeans and a plain gray t-shirt and brought a paintbrush and a can of Army Green. He didn't ask for help. He didn't take photos. He just sat for a moment, then repainted the bench with slow, careful strokes, like penance or maybe reverence. And when he was done, he sat down for a minute more, wiped his hands with a rag, and left without a word. He came back again on Veterans Day and the next year after that. No media ever picked up the story. No influencers came calling, but sometimes an old veteran would stop by, sit on that bench, and stare at the space where the truck once waited. They'd nod to themselves. Because some transformations aren't loud, some legacies don't shine. They endure quietly in wood, in gravel, and in men who remember. Joe Kesler's story isn't just about a truck. It's about how we see people and how easily we forget what they've carried. In today's world, we move fast. We scroll past faces, rush past stories, and judge worth by polish and price tags. But dignity doesn't wear labels, and service doesn't always come in uniforms. Sometimes it walks into a dealership in worn-out boots and a flannel shirt, carrying the weight of a war we barely remember. Joe didn't ask for attention. He didn't demand recognition. He simply lived with honor. And when the moment came, he was met with silence, not pity, earned silence. The kind that only respect can buy. So here's the question for you. How many Joes have we walked past without noticing? How many stories have we overlooked because someone didn't look the part? If this story moved you, share a time when someone surprised you with quiet strength. Or tell us, what does true respect look like in today's world? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe some debts are paid in grit, not gold, like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that remember what matters on Valor Stories. Because sometimes the most powerful engine isn't under the hood. It's in the heart that drove it and the memory that never lets it stall.